project of knowledge we call science.
Oh, give the man a bloody medal! You're all this little boy!
Now, Breck. Cut to expose the infected area.
But how could cadaveric material enter the bloodstream of a pregnant? It rushed into my mind with irresistible clarity that if the disease from which Kolechka died was the same as that which proved fatal to so many women after childbirth, then the cause could be identical. Did the women I see dying have cadaveric material carried into their circulation too?
It's very putrid, sir. That's not unusual, Breck. Carry on.
To that question, I could only answer yes.
Every morning, ironically in the best tradition of the Vienna school, the students attended Professor Klein in the labor ward, examining women in childbirth. And they'd come there direct from the dissecting room. Semmelweis had pointed the way at last to a true understanding of disease. But so many things had conspired to obscure the real value of his results. Above all, his own obstinate adherence to the idea that the truth will out. In October 1850, disheartened, bitter, short of money, Semmelweis, without even saying goodbye to his friends, left Vienna.
The geneticist C.H. Waddington once said that the biggest barrier to the progress of science is the conventional way that most scientists think. Tonight we're going to discuss whether brilliant new ideas still run the risk of being consigned to the dustbin of scientific history. Martin Fleischmann, over the last 5 years, ever since back in 1989, you revealed to the world your experiments on cold fusion. You must have been feeling, with the reception that your experiments have had, somewhat like Ignaz Semmelweis.
Yes, I think that is partly true. I always hedge when I get asked questions like that. I think the important point in science is to ask first, what was the question you asked? And to confront that question. And then you have to, up to a point, exclude the influences which come to you from the outside. That if you want to stay as an objective scientist, of course you'd prefer not to be criticized, but in the end, if you hold on to that, you will be relatively immune to the criticism, if you can. If you can't, you're finished.
Once you discover cold fusion, then what do you do? How do you actually then convince the scientific world that there is a major new discovery on its hands?
Well, that is extremely difficult. In fact, it is so difficult that although we went public, we were made to go public in March 1989, our objective was still to stay secret. Let's be quite precise. You are still in a phase when you are criticizing your own work. You're still subjecting it to a detailed analysis. Then, as I always say, you don't go to the top of the Empire State Building or the top of the Tokyo Tower and shout about it.
But that's precisely what you did, in fact. Don't you think it would have been more in accord with the scientific tradition to have actually submitted your evidence to your peers who could have evaluated it? I mean, everybody was put in the very disadvantageous situation of responding to a press release, a press conference.
That is absolutely incorrect. I'm sorry, that is incorrect.
I'd like to just, I think we're all talking in a vacuum here. Maybe a good idea to show the clip of the press conference.
Whoever said great scientific dreams come in large, expensive packages? Instead of experimenting with giant machines costing millions of dollars, a British and Utah scientist may have found the answer to our energy problems in a glass tube.
On March the 23rd of last year, the University of Utah held a press conference for the two scientists to explain their amazing discovery.
This experiment has to be approached with some caution. Because this device, if this device worked as rapidly as the small-scale electrodes which we've run, this would be generating about 800 watts of heat.
Martin Fleischmann, Professor of Chemistry at the University of Southampton, Fellow of the Royal Society, renowned for his imaginative and brilliant work in electrochemistry.
We have to bear in mind that this news came within hours of the Exxon Valdez oil spill, and with memories of Chernobyl still fresh in everyone's minds. Therefore, the promise of cheap and clean energy, and limitless at that, was obviously going to have an enormous impact at that particular time. I think everyone who's followed this event unfolding would have to agree that the rules were broken in the sense that you did not have a detailed publication accepted by a journal. Now,
I'm sorry, I must correct you. We had a preliminary paper accepted for publication. You are just simply wrong, and you should not perpetuate a statement which is incorrect.
I think the statement isn't incorrect, because I think the great criticism about cold fusion was that you did not supply enough details for other scientists to come along and replicate your results.
However, I was very clear. I recommended people to wait until they had a detailed publication in hand. I told
but nevertheless,
them,
you still had the press conference. You went ahead with the press conference, you let the genie out of the bottle, and then you said, let's be cautious.
well, good heavens, how many genies have been let out of the bottle by everybody? If you think that you can only communicate science with detailed papers, I guarantee that you have not read our detailed paper. Have you read our detailed
Yes,
paper?
well, I have actually.
Even when people publish papers intending to provide the whole recipe, if the science isn't thoroughly well known in the laboratories that are trying to repeat it, they're not going to be able to manage it, because all the scientists are learning new skills. They're learning to do new things, and you can't transmit how to do new skills just in a few lines. And in new and wild areas of science, in unusual areas of science, that's what it's like.
But at the same time, I completely agree with David that to announce to the world this extraordinary discovery with incredible implications, and not, by Martin's own account, to provide, apparently it would appear deliberately, enough details to allow your colleagues to replicate the experiment, that creates chaos, that creates a mess, and that's exactly what happened.
Can I point something out? That if in fact cold fusion experiments, if the thing was going ahead swimmingly, nobody would be the slightest bit worried about how much.
If he'd given enough details for people to repeat it.
No, they wouldn't be worried at all.
Absolutely, but he said deliberately, if I understood you, you didn't do that. And that really is a disservice to colleagues.
That is not correct. You don't know all the information you should put in.
Given his beliefs about how it works and so on, he might have thought it would be easy for everyone to replicate it.
Let's ask him. Let's ask him. Did you think when you gave the conference that everybody could repeat it?
Yes.
And then you turned out to be wrong?
Well, I thought that if the experiment was done sufficiently carefully, that it would be relatively easy to replicate. People did not do it sufficiently carefully, and I think this is something which will emerge during the next 2 years.
Walter, if you look at the reception of Martin's work by the scientific community, do you see a kind of unwillingness to be open to new ideas?
On the quite contrary, I would say, and perhaps Martin has a different point of view, that this is one of the success stories in science, and the scientists acted like scientists. They went out there and they tried to repeat the work, and I think that makes me feel very good. That's the way science ought to work.
Well, I think this brings the point home that even when labs go out and try and replicate experiments, very controversial experiments, that doesn't necessarily mean you're going to get an end to the debate. It just can rumble on for years, and it can degenerate into sort of almost pantomime-like exchange of, I can do the experiment, oh no you can't, oh yes I can.
I think the first thing that a lot of people might not understand is how little consensus there is in ordinary science anyway. It always seems as though consensus is somewhere over there, but if you look at scientists who are actually working, you find that they don't feel there's so much consensus about the things that they're doing. Let's take this famous idea of peer review. Here's a clip of John Maddox, the editor of Nature, talking about peer review.
The community of scientists has its own way of doing things. Even the most earth-shattering discovery should be reported in a learned journal, usually the British magazine Nature. Every article submitted to Nature goes through a checking process called peer review. The draft is sent for assessment to various experts in the field. Pons and Fleischmann had submitted an article the day after the press conference. The experts came back in record time with requests for more detail.
We sent them these comments. As I remember, the paper went through 2 series of revisions. The first produced a paper that was still unsatisfactory to the referees, and we asked them a second set of questions, telling them, look, we don't care how long the paper is. We want these questions fully dealt with. And they decided, I think it was quite legitimate on their point of view, that they didn't have the time to do that.
I mean, it seems very straightforward. It seems you send the paper, referees will ask reasonable comments, and authors will respond to them, as though somehow or other this automatically guarantees that the outcome, anything that's published, will be correct. But let's just see a clip here of a couple of scientists receiving a paper that's just been peer-reviewed in another field. This, again, will be a familiar experience to many scientists.
This is the paper returned. Both referees feel the paper as presented is not acceptable for Hambo Journal. They argue that to publish the results at present will be premature and that a great deal more work needs to be done before the manuscripts would be acceptable. Do you find molecularly the change is occurring? God, that's just balmy.
Yes, I've had that experience.
More than one cell line should be used. I mean, that's bizarre, really. You can't.
It's absolutely... I can see no reason why another cell line would respond in the same way.
If this study had been accompanied by a demonstration that a specific molecule had changed, look at these people.
But I mean,
but you're going to do
way
what you're going to
use
with heat shock, talifying, glucocorticoids. It's going to have massive effects on the cell. You'd never be able to distinguish. I mean, that's the most ludicrous comment I've ever seen.
Here are bright young men who've been broken by a rejection slip.
Oh, they've not been broken by the rejection. It's sort of upset them for 10 minutes. They're pissed off that their paper didn't get into the journal, and fair enough, but they'll rewrite it, they'll do the experiments. It's a very rare piece of work that doesn't find it into the literature.
That's right, you will always
and it's not read.
But you have this bureaucratic
Sure.
process where you've got people trying to second-guess nature. Because eventually, if your work is correct, if Martin Fleischmann's work is correct, doesn't matter what any of us think round here.
Oh, our great-grandchildren will be sat warming their hands against cold fusion
But
reactors.
peer review
Sure.
has got to be more than a bureaucratic process, especially in the field of medicine, because the peer review process is the sole form of the policing of science.
Well,
that exists.
the problem about
that's not true. In other words, peer review is just one of the things, and to say it's the sole policing is wrong, because as you pointed out, the appeal to the future, towards time.
Tell me of other ways.
Well, it's just the conflict. I think there's a fundamental misconception here that the function of the scientific literature is not to receive established truth so that when you put it in, it stays there forever. It's to contain debate.
Sure.
And we all have to, perhaps we've been wrong as scientists in not emphasizing to the public that this is an ongoing process of debate. And half of these ideas roughly are wrong. Many are unimportant, and the important ones eventually will triumph. And
well, I don't agree they will eventually triumph.
Exactly.
I mean, I think in the AIDS debate, for example, when there are such vast financial interests vested in protecting the HIV/AIDS hypothesis, how is any peer reviewer going to be objective enough to actually look at a paper by Professor Peter Duesberg and say this must be published? I have the correspondence he had with the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences before his first paper was published. It is unbelievable. I find the peer review, reverence for the peer review process very worrying, because I think actually it's dangerous.
May I just make one point which I think is very important to focus our discussion on peer review. You have to say, what are you peer reviewing for? It is very good for middle-of-the-road mainstream science, for making a judgment there. It is obviously totally useless for innovative science.
Harry Collins, do you feel that what is actually happening in this structure of science is that a permanent cast of outsiders is being created and is being permanently judged by a class of insiders?
Well, one thing I think that's really usefully come out of this debate is we've moved away from one sort of notion of peer review to another. You can now start to see peer review as a debate, not as a process that everybody has to go through to be respectable. And as soon as they've been through it, they are respectable. In fact, it's a debate rather of the sort of debate we're having here. But the question is, what can it do when it's working at its very best? Even then, the question is, does this create a class of insiders and outsiders? And I think it does. You can see how it feels by listening to Eric Laithwaite. Eric Laithwaite was a professor of electrical engineering who about 10 years ago said he had a new theory of gyroscopes. Here's Eric Laithwaite talking at the Royal Institution.
What a pleasure it is to talk to young people who are ready to listen after you've talked to adults. Quite the most amazing letter I had was from a man who wrote quite unemotionally that he'd performed some of the experiments that I'd done some 10 years ago. And he knew that they worked, but he added, I've not told any of my colleagues or friends because even though I occupy quite a senior post in the scientific civil service, I still have a few years to go to retirement and I still cherish hopes of further promotion. That is a hell of a thing to say in a scientific world, isn't it? This man dare not tell his colleagues. We talk about blackbirds pecking out the white feathers of their colleagues or killing them if they can't because they didn't conform.
If you didn't do that, if you didn't apply more rigorous standards to things that most people thought were crazy, then you'd have spent an awful lot of time dealing with crazy things. And I think a lot of that is here in what we're talking about now. An efficient system will be one which, on the whole, biases towards the ones who are going to turn out to be right. And an inefficient system will let everything in and waste a lot of time. Whether we've got the balance right, I don't know.
David, you as a science journalist must know the frustrations of dealing with a crazy system that lets everything in. There's some new sensation every week, isn't there?
Well, there is. I mean, there's a danger in seeing outsiders as a coherent group. That's not a coherent group. They come in many shapes and sizes, and they have different attitudes and beliefs and approaches to science. What I find disturbing, I have to say, about people like Peter Duesberg, and to a certain extent Martin, is that they seem to be bound up more in dogma, and they don't seem to retain that open mind to their own experiments.
I would like you to prove me where I am.
It's the other people that are bound in dogma.
We apply this question about checking up. I mean, we check the whole time. We check on
dogmatic about your own experiments.
We check on bias. We check on fraud. We check on. We've checked on everybody. We check on each other. I check on Stan Pons. Stan Pons checks on me. I mean, you have to do that.
Two dogmatists standing there, pointing at each other, accusing each other of being dogmatic.
That's the essence of polarisation, which you said a moment ago is so bad.
You should never talk about dogma.
Oh,
we
okay,
are all fallibility.
Being prepared to admit nearly all the time that your theories or experiments could conceivably just be wrong.
But you always admit that.
We all make mistakes. The world's divided into people who admit them and the ones who don't. And good scientists change their mind and progress. And the public sees science as a static truth, whereas in fact it's a dynamic process of testing and balancing and changing.
And you know, when you challenge the orthodoxy, I mean, to accuse Duesberg of dogma is absolutely mad. How many years did it take Galileo to be absolved by the Catholic Church? 380, I think it was.
Well, I think we might actually be able to see Galileo on the screen in front of us now.
Tonight, the Holy Office has decided that the theory according to which the Earth goes around the Sun is foolish, absurd, and a heresy. I am charged, Signor Galilei, with cautioning you to abandon these teachings. Would you repeat that?
His Eminence Cardinal Bellarmine to the aforesaid Galilei. Tonight the Holy Office has decided that the theory according to which the Earth goes around the Sun is foolish, absurd, and a heresy. I am charged, Signor Galilei, with cautioning you to abandon these teachings.
But the facts!
Your findings have been ratified by the Papal Observatory, Galilei. That should be most flattering to you.
The Holy Office formulated the decree without going into details.
Your Eminence, don't you realize that the whole future of scientific research
is completely assured?
Maybe science has to be this way. I mean, maybe non-conformists have to be driven out because people are terrified of what will happen to the structure of science if you get too many odd people in. But the danger is if you drive everybody out this way, if you react too strongly, if you're too frightened as a scientist, if the scientific community is too frightened to do its own dirty work. And one sees this, I think, most clearly when members of the scientific community start bringing, shall we say, magicians, outsiders in to try and do the dirty work. of rejecting people they can't get on with.
Oh, I think that's completely unfair. You're referring perhaps to Randi.
Indeed.
And there's a totally...
James Randi.
James Randi, the amazing Randi, a mathematician, a magician, well respected for his debunking of faith healers. And there's a perfectly good rationale. Indeed, I was the person who suggested it.
There may be a case for bringing in magicians to examine, to help one guard against fraud. But what about the case of Jacques Benveniste, when Nature, and you were part of the team, took a magician across to a scientist's laboratory and, as one might say, did a number on him?
It all began in June, when Nature published a paper and then took the extraordinary step of suggesting that the findings were unbelievable. The paper was written by Professor Benveniste, an immunologist of international repute, and his team at the French National Institute for Medical Research. A condition of publication was that an independent team of investigators should visit the French lab after the paper was printed. And here, the story becomes more like pantomime than science. The team was James Randi, a conjurer who exposed the spoon-bending magic of Uri Geller, Walter Stewart, professional fraud buster, and Nature's editor, John Maddox, who selected this unorthodox group.
I am appalled at the fact that our 5-year work and the work of 5 teams on such a critical issue would be blown out by such a masquerade of investigation. They insisted in taking part in the experiment themselves. Doing so, they changed some critical steps in the experiments. They, in fact, didn't know how to properly do the code.
These codes keep researchers from knowing which test tubes are in the experiment. They taped them to the ceiling to prevent cheating.
All these Hollywood paraphernalia of the envelope on the ceiling, it was a pantomime.
The result of the investigation was that Nature published a complete dismissal of the French team's claims, together with Professor Benveniste's criticism of the fraudbusters' visit and defense of his own work.
There were 3 people there. I was skilled in the analysis of the science and the math, and Randi was there to do something I couldn't possibly do to prevent cheating. And I think Nature's following the exact right course. Instead of using peer review to suppress publication, they're using peer review to enhance debate. You want a debate out there.
It's a question of who the peer reviewers are allowed to be. Normally, the one thing that might help scientists to accept adverse criticism from peer reviewers is its criticism coming from people who've exposed themselves to the research front
This is the precise wrong idea, that a person may comment on somebody's research only by virtue of credentials. A PhD, being a member of the club, this is exactly the wrong idea.
The issue of being in the club is actually crucial here, isn't it? Because people's lives may sometimes be at stake, and Rosie Daniel, for example, who runs the Bristol Cancer Help Centre, her centre was subjected to a kind of peer review by the Imperial Cancer Fund recently.
That's correct, yes. The history of this situation is that when there was a 6-part series televised about the centre way back in the early 80s, the condition on which the BBC would televise that was that they also could televise a debate with members from the CRC and the ICRF, during which the gauntlet was thrown down that we be researched. 18 months into a 5-year study, when somebody hit the computer button one day and came up with some extremely damaging-looking results, which showed that people coming to Bristol were at greater risk of both dying and relapsing with cancer, a press conference was called, a paper was put into the Lancet.
The press conference was called by whom?
By the ICRF.
Women with breast cancer who choose to fight the disease by using alternative therapy are significantly less likely to survive than those who choose conventional treatments.
Despite a royal seal of approval 7 years ago from the Prince of Wales, a well-known supporter of alternative medicine, the Bristol Cancer Centre has continued to provoke considerable controversy among doctors. But until now, there's been no scientific assessment of the centre's methods. The study compared more than 300 women with breast cancer who attended the centre and also received conventional treatment, with more than 400 women who only received conventional hospital care. The study concluded that those who'd followed the Bristol regime were 3 times more likely to have the cancer spread than those treated conventionally.
A much less publicised fact is that 6 months later, with adjusted data, they found that there was no difference whatsoever. They're talking now about a genuine scientific mistake, but I think that they were sufficiently biased in their desire to discredit the work, that the minute they had any data, that they became blinded to the usual scientific process of really analysing what they were seeing.
I think one of the big problems is that the public in general can't work with uncertainties and probabilities.
Right, that's right.
They can't accept that. That's one of the biggest problems we face. I come across this very much in the forensic science field. If someone has been to court at some time and presented evidence on a particular point of view, and then later on, perhaps a year or 2 later, he will have changed his view on that and gone back to court and presented a different view of that evidence. And that is very much criticised by the judiciary, who in a sense represent society.
The problem is that science can't deliver the sort of certainties on the sort of timescales that most people think it can. Here's a piece of uncertainty in high-energy physics.
This is exactly what we would expect if we had a W produced in the centre here. However, there are some things which are not yet clear. In fact, the major reason of doubt is that we get energy also deposited behind the electromagnetic part of our calorimetry, which would not, on the face of it, be expected if this was really a W candidate.
One possibility would be that there are really 2 particles going that way. One neutral that manages to look like an electron in the electron calorimeter, and yet there's a completely different particle which is going through and giving energy in the hadron calorimeters behind. So that is a possible way that you could get a background.
I think that they will soon know what we're doing, but there's still a long way between a raw experimental observation, which exceptionally could be still raw, and the final scientific interpretation of the results.
You've seen that. You've seen the tentative way people are talking about things. You've seen the way that the statistics are tending towards something. Some people think that they've got enough to announce a result, other people don't. But then this is crystallised into a sort of single-point discovery. Both Carlo Rubbia, the director of CERN, helps to crystallise this for whatever reasons he has, and the media join in. Listen closely to the narration, and this is a Horizon programme.
Nobody wants to jump the gun, but Carlo Rubbia and his colleagues were increasingly optimistic. On the 20th of January this year, he was confident enough to address a packed meeting of CERN scientists to announce the results of the experiment.
Global calorimetry emitting energy.
As the data was reviewed and analysed, and as final doubts were answered, their confidence hardened.
The search for isolated large p-perp electrons.
3 days ago, at 3 p.m. on the 21st of January 1983, CERN made the following announcement. UA1 has singled out 5 events in a total of 1,000 million collisions, revealing the expected signature of the charged W boson. So the experiment to find the W has succeeded. And history may well look back on the Geneva event as the most important advance since the experiments of Faraday towards the grand unification of all the forces of nature.
Whatever's happening, there is almost a conspiracy here to present a picture of science to the general public which says we make point discoveries. And at that point we've got certainty or uncertainty. Au contraire, if they hear that, they don't know how to judge what experts say. They think it has to be right or wrong.
I'd like now to go on to talk about, if I may, Roy, to talk about what I consider as a medical journalist, but I'm not alone in this, to be one of the biggest blunders, if I'm being generous, or mistakes in the history of medicine. Professor Peter Duesberg 7 years ago was a lone voice. He said HIV cannot possibly cause AIDS. It cannot be pathogenic. Since then, he has been persistently ignored, stifled by his peers, ridiculed in the press and some science journals. These are his views in a nutshell.
I believe that AIDS is not or cannot even be an infectious disease. See, an infectious disease, believe it or not, has certain criteria to it. How it happens, when it happens. For example, if you get infected by a bug or by a virus, within weeks or months after a contact or after that infection, you will have symptoms of a disease. In HIV and AIDS, however, we are told you get sick 10 years later, 10 years after infection. That is not how viruses or bacteria even work. They work fast or never. They are very simple mechanisms, like a little clock, that can do only one thing, go around the dial once, and that takes 24 to 48 hours with the virus. There's no way that virus could possibly slow down or wait a week or wait 10 years. That is totally absurd.
Now I'd like to show you a tape that illustrates the reaction of perhaps his greatest opponent, and that's Dr. Robert Gallo.
Question for Dr. Gallo. Professor Robert Root Bernstein, author of Rethinking AIDS, has said that by the end of the century we'll know everything there is to know about HIV and nothing about AIDS. Given that all of Professor Peter Duesberg's predictions have come true, when will you, Dr. Gallo, agree that we need to fund a total reappraisal of the HIV/AIDS hypothesis, not dictated to by the search for endless, new, useless and damaging antivirals?
Okay, thank you for the statement. Short answer.
I think Dr. Root Bernstein doesn't know what he's talking about. Okay.
I would like
no discussion, please. Sorry. Next question. Up to there.
The answer is, I think he's wrong, and I think any rational person who's looked at this carefully, slowly, and is trained has come to the same conclusion that he's wrong. I don't influence funding. I'm not a director of an institute. I do my work. I'm working on HIV as the cause of this disease. I have since 1984. If you and Ruth Bernstein don't believe it, so be it. Do your own work on what you think the cause is and don't bother me.
Now, this is what I find so extraordinary about the scientific community. Duesberg wasn't invited. Gallo, who'd just been found guilty of scientific misconduct, is the star with 3 bodyguards.
Lawrence, as a working scientist, you've seen the Duesberg case, the Gallo case. In what sort of a way does the persecution of Duesberg come across here?
Peter Duesberg certainly has been very successful in challenging an initially incorrect orthodox view as to what HIV was doing in the generation of AIDS. And very few people now would believe that AIDS is caused by HIV slowly killing all the T4 cells directly. The reason Duesberg is so infuriating, I found myself going through yet again this, watching this guy, a tremendous scientist whose earlier work I have nothing but absolute respect for. And he's doing what he always does, which is he's saying something that's actually blatantly untrue. And I'll tell you what he said that is blatantly untrue. He says there that there is no virus in the world. Nobody ever heard viruses come in, you can hang around for a couple of weeks, you get the disease, they go away. They don't remain latent. Now, forget retroviruses straight away, which remain latent in all sorts of other circumstances other than HIV.
Not in the same way.
Listen
not
to this.
Triggered, not 10 years later, triggered into killing you.
Do you ever have herpes, Joan?
Herpes is different in any case.
No, herpes is a virus that will remain latent for...
not a retrovirus.
Let him finish.
Are you a retrovirologist or not?
The guy is telling me that everything's different. When he can use general virology and when he can't use general
Can I just tell you what a retrovirus does?
I know what a retrovirus
It goes into the genome.
I've worked with retroviruses,
and a virus destroys.
Lawrence, your point is essentially that here is a scientist who is saying something, despite the fact that he is one of the world's leading virologists, he is making a crass scientific error.
I have no truck whatsoever with the idea that Duesberg should be persecuted, with the idea that Duesberg should not be allowed to present his results, and the idea that Duesberg's funding has been pared down to absolutely nothing is absolutely outrageous and indefensible.
Well, it's because of things like that you're saying.
I'm merely saying that the guy has been totally disingenuous.
People don't understand the science because he hasn't been given
I agree completely that Duesberg's statement of things is deliberately simplistic. He's much too good a scientist to believe that that's the full extent of the matter, and it's misleading. And I think he's partially he's partially responsible for the debasement of the debate. And
David,
we mustn't fall into the trap of thinking that just because someone's being persecuted, that they've therefore got a good theory or something positive to contribute to the debate. I think it's actually rather disingenuous to set Duesberg up as this sort of romantic vision of a latter-day Galileo, when and he clearly isn't. There are major differences. He has not, for a start, he has not put forward a credible, scientifically credible alternative.
Millions of people are dying of AIDS, and you need to have a working hypothesis as to how you're going to attempt to cure them.
Not one that is wrong and that suppresses
what others have you got?
the minority.
Sorry, scientists indulging in rhetoric and being very selective with the evidence, and layered on top of that, we have the media, which is again being selective in the way it presents people like Duesberg and his supporters.
Well, you work for the New Scientist.
It seems everybody has agreed on something I would advance is even more important than the particulars of who's right about the hypothesis, because we have to sort that out scientifically, which is we all agree that the process of scientific debate and the ignoring of Duesberg and the punishing of him are improper and wrong. And I would say those things are the things you can point to for sure that we all agree on as being bad.
Actually, if you let everybody have their say all the time, then science will be completely swamped by chaos, because there are as many heterodox ideas as there are fools.
You can easily distinguish between a crank and a genius. Cranks
Can you?
You really can, because I've had 14 years' experience of it. You really can. A crank keeps saying the same thing over and over and over again. Now, a genius responds to an environment in which there's breadth. The only way we can try to ensure that we communicate a little more with nature and try to uncover more of nature's secrets is by fostering diversity. And rather than persecuting the Duesbergs and the Fleischmanns of this world, we should be thanking them for asking questions that no one has yet had the courage or the imagination to begin to ask. I believe that we must try to encourage credible heretics. When I started this venture research game 10 years ago,
explain that.
Which is looking for those people who are credibly challenging conventional wisdom, who are offering the possibility that they will change the way we think about something important and asking new questions. Let 1,000 blossoms bloom. But my venture research
rather bad precedent to take, I think, the Cultural Revolution. Do not
the venture research thing was to encourage people to come to us. Martin Fleischmann never came to me. I'm great regret, you know. I wish he had, because he was asking questions.
He might come to me.
Oh, well, you never know. Absolutely, yes. Now we're looking for new funding. Now our funding's dried up. But you see, diversity is it.
The skill we have to have more and more is not in conducting the research, but is in fundraising. We've had to become really, really good fundraisers. We've had to find excuses to do fundamental research. So we always have to try and find a medical angle, if you can hang it on a disease or on some biotechnological process to make some appalling fast food more effectively than you could do before. And it really is a tremendous danger that we're just going to die in this sort of conservative, safe science where nobody does anything they can't be certain is going to succeed.
It sounds like going back to Galileo, where an individual could stand up against the church.
It's just going back. It's going back to the way Max Perutz ran the MRC laboratory in Cambridge for many, many years, where his job was to bring in the money, assemble a team of scientific lunatics and let them play. And let them play without having to worry about bringing in the money or worry about their jobs. And they produce monoclonal antibodies and they produce the structure of DNA.
That's so wonderful, and it sounds almost dissipated when you say let scientists play, but what the public needs to know is the fantastic advances have come out of this exact environment. And
Can I do my clip? I've got a clip. What you're seeing there is the thing that certainly has motivated me to keep on in this very badly paid business, which is that every now and then you do something, you look at the result, and you realize that, you know, God is looking over your shoulder and you have just seen, you are the person who's just seen something entirely new that may transform the world, or at least our vision of it. And it's there in front of you, and it's a thing of such excitement. And it's tremendously sad to me that that doesn't get over, and that there is a generation of people growing up who see science as just the most stuffy, dull, uninteresting thing.
Oh, but I think that does get over. Here we are in the Exploratory, and it was Richard Gregory, who's always goes on about fun and science, who's made this possible, and also has given me, and I think a lot of other people, the idea that it's fun.
It's beautiful, Francis.